You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. So when I'm not creating my own podcast and writing my own newsletters and books, I spend a fair amount of time digging into health-related content that others are producing. And like many of you, I frequently listen to Dr. Peter Attia's The Drive podcast, and I recently finished his book, Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity. The thing I like most about Attia is his push for a medicine 3.0 revolution, specifically that the medical system should be a true healthcare system rather than a sick care system, and that it should be geared to keeping us healthy rather than treating us once we're on the verge of disease or we actually have disease. And I'm not sure that I will live long enough to see that kind of a revolution in the healthcare system. But that doesn't mean that I can't be proactive in my own way and start practicing that kind of self-care. There are many online services that provide that kind of medical care where you can get your DNA analyzed and your blood work analyzed, and they take your mental health and your lifestyle and your goals, and they boil it all down and offer you advice to help you be your best, healthiest self, and so that your biological age will be younger per se than your chronological age as time goes by. So with all that in mind, I was psyched to have a chance to sit down with this week's guest, four-time CrossFit Games athlete and physician, Dr. Julie Foucher, who practices this kind of precision medicine with Wild Health. And she has her own forward-thinking podcast called Pursuing Health. We talk all about the potential benefits of precision medicine for perimenopause and postmenopause, along with much, much more. This conversation kind of goes far and wide. We talk fasting, we talk inflammation, developing a healthy mindset. And I really appreciate Julie's openness and interest in serving women through all phases of life. She is on the younger side of things herself, but she is keenly interested in that forward-thinking medicine 3.0 vision for women of her generation and our generation. So really grateful for the conversation, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. And to be clear, and I've thought about this a lot, I know precision medicine is not accessible to everyone. And there is most definitely a pay-to-play element of menopause care, or hell, any care, especially here in the US. And this is something that I do think about a lot, that women with monetary means have the ability to buy and try all kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons that though we certainly create products that cost money here because I have to eat and keep a roof over my head and pay the vet bills and college tuition, and there are many people behind the scenes of this podcast who do amazing, amazing work, and we all need to make a living. We are also very sure and certain that we keep producing content that is free, and as much of that content that is free as possible. The podcast, my weekly newsletter, the Hit Play Not Pause Facebook group, all of those resources are open for everyone, and largely because we really do want as many women to have access to that information as possible. I also do think that some of these services are worth saving up for. I've done some precision medicine type of care myself, and I did find it worth the investment to get a full portrait of my health and fitness and to get pretty much a guidebook worth of advice on what to do to make and keep myself as healthy as I can be. Because in the long run, I believe I'm betting on it saving me money. Disease is expensive. Doctor's visits are expensive. Medications, copays, they all add up. And that's just the cold, hard cash expenses. There's also the time and energy spent managing conditions. And for me personally, as I crossed into my mid-50s recently, it just felt like a solid investment. All that said, my hope is that these services, these types of medicine 3.0 healthcare services, become more accessible to more women, more people, but I'm talking to women here, because I think we all deserve the best of personalized care. All right. Before we get into it, as always, check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Feisty Menopause. Sign up for my free weekly menopause blog at feistymenopause.com. You can learn more about all of these topics and have one-on-one time with experts at our at our Level Up Menopause membership as well. And thanks, as always, for the continued great reviews and 5-star ratings. I appreciate them, and they really do help the show. All right. Super quick thanks to the Amino Company, Amino Co., for their continued support of the show. Their Perform product has become my best early morning swim companion. I grab a bottle on the way to the lake or to the pool, and it sets me up for success with key electrolytes, branched chain, and other amino acids, along with a small hit of caffeine to give me that extra mental clarity and performance boost. And I also think it tastes good. So thank you, Aminoco, for your continued support of the podcast. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right. I am really stoked to have you here, Julie. I'm a fan of your work. I'm a fan of your thoughtfulness and what you bring to the CrossFit space and other spaces. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Celine. I'm a big fan of yours also, so I'm excited for this conversation.
Well, speaking of, we had talked before and I sent you these questions, and then I heard on one of my runs this amazing podcast that you did on Wild Health, which I'll link in the show notes, on fasting for women. And this is a conversation I think is so important, and I would love to just open this one with that, because man, there's so many misconceptions yet, and I would love to hear you talk a bit about, you know, fasting in women and how we are more sensitive to it. I personally, when I tried it, my cortisol got worse, my fasting blood sugar got worse, like all these things that were supposed to get better got worse. So
Right.
if you could address that a little bit, I'd love it.
I would love to. It's such a important topic, a hot topic, and I really enjoyed that discussion. I did that podcast with Dr. Erin Donaldson, who's another Wild Health physician, and we love getting on and just talking about anything related to women. So it was really fun to do. And I think, it's something that I see all the time because we work with a population of women in Wild Health who I would say tend towards women who are already into fitness, who are already striving for health, and have been for much of their lives. And fasting is a really powerful tool. There's a lot of research on it, specifically in men, not a lot in women yet. But the research there has shown some really incredible benefits when it comes to things like metabolic health and cancer prevention and longevity. And so, of course, whenever there's a new health trend, we get some data in men and it's like, well, everybody should do it. And the more, the better. Right. And so I think, I've tried it in various aspects. I think a lot of people, have tried it to see how it functions for them. But we have to think about fasting as, like anything, it is a tool, right? And it is a hormetic stressor, just like exercise is a hormetic stressor, which just means it has this bell-shaped curve where there's a sweet spot where you put this stressor on your body and your body adapts in a favorable way. But if you don't do enough, you don't get that adaptation. And if you do too much, it can have a negative impact. So things like, if you have too much exercise without enough recovery, you get overtraining. And same thing with fasting. You have to look at what is your overall stress load on your body, or what we call your allostatic load. What are all of the stressors that you're being exposed to? And that could be, your training volume, how much you're training and your intensity of training. It could be your nutrition. It could be, are you not sleeping enough? That could be a stressor. It could be, of course, psychological stressors. What's going on in life? Are you taking care of, sick parents or sick kids? Are you having financial stress, life stress, even just, day-to-day traffic and email and notifications are stressors. And then you have environmental stressors too. So all of us are exposed to toxins in our environment. Obviously, we can do our best to minimize those, but living in the world today, we're exposed to those as well. And so you have to look at infections. Those are another source of stress. You have to look at what's the overall allostatic load or the stress load on your body. And where does fasting fit into that, right? If you already have a huge stress load and your body is struggling to keep up, adding in even a small amount of fasting could push you over the edge and contribute to more symptoms or more, dysfunction in your stress response. Versus, it might be a tools, in certain amounts, maybe not every day, but periodically to help be a little bit of that hormetic stressor and drive some adaptation. Or it might be something you use more frequently if you're someone who, is facing a lot of metabolic disease and, your overall, it fits into that picture of overall stressors and stress load. And then for women specifically, we have to think about the impact of our hormones and when is the right time to be doing fasting.
Yeah, and when you talk about women in perimenopause or menopause who are also training, exercising, I see women running into low energy availability. I just see more problems than benefits with it. I'm wondering what your experience is there.
I have a very similar experience with the women that I work with. So I tend to see the pattern of women who are coming to me around the time of perimenopause who are, type A, hard driving, hard workers their entire lives, right? So they're competing in their sport, training hard, they have families, they have jobs, and, maybe for long periods of time have been through different diet fads and diet trends where maybe they've been really low carb or restricting calories at certain points in their lives. And so then you throw in maybe a life stressor here and there, you throw in perimenopause, and now you add fasting into the mix, and that can often be just too much for the body to handle. So I often see women when they're in that somewhere in that mix, and we're starting to see an overall negative impact where we see some increase in stress hormones or dysfunction in the stress axis, the HPA axis. And oftentimes that can present with a variety of different symptoms from, GI symptoms to autoimmune disease, sleep problems, all kinds of things.
And so many of them are coming into it wanting to lose weight, right? Like that's a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
like what they're trying to manage. And
Right.
um I'm not sure that it has the end result that they're looking for when you yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's when I think it's really hard because we have these perceptions of it's so hard to break those perceptions of, okay, what do we need to do to lose weight? For so many years, we've been receiving these messages of, okay, I need to restrict calories, restrict carbs. And now we've got fasting as another tool. Let's throw that in. And so now you've got a situation where you're not supporting your training level with enough calories or enough carbohydrates, and you're adding the stressor of fasting. Now you have what's called HP axis dysfunction, or even to the point of, like you said, low energy availability or relative energy deficiency syndrome, RED-S. And that can be very hard to recover from and can cause the opposite effect of what you're going for. So you're trying to lose weight and shift body composition and have good performance in your workouts, but instead now you're actually hanging on to excess body fat. It's becoming very difficult to lose that. And you just don't feel good, right? And
Yeah.
your performance starts to go down. And this is where it becomes really hard and requires a really good therapeutic relationship, a lot of education, a lot of trust in order to start digging out of that hole, because the solution is really the thing that you're most afraid of, right? It's adding back in calories. It's maybe reducing your exercise volume. It's trying to regain that balance of allostatic load of, stressors and recovery so that your body feels safe and that it can start to let go of that extra weight and heal from some of those symptoms.
And I really enjoyed, which, it hadn't even occurred to me to think of it this way in that conversation that you had, that so many times that when people, in this audience, I hear it a lot, when they want to implement it, they don't eat breakfast. They sort of like push that
Mm.
meal into the
Hmm.
later parts of the day, but that's sort of like out of the circadian rhythm of what we really need, especially at this time of life, right? Because it kind of
Yes.
dumps our calories at the end of the day, messes up our sleep, and just sets up this, you're talking about this allostatic load. That's also very stressful, right?
Totally. Yeah. I think it's a big cultural adjustment, right? Because typically people's biggest meal of the day now, the meal that they often get with their families or loved ones is dinner, and that's later in the day. And, evolutionarily, and if you look back at different cultures over time, often the biggest meal was in the middle of the day. And they're eating when the sun is up, and when the sun is down, they're not eating. So, if we wanted to fast according to that rhythm, that would look more like waking up and eating breakfast and having a bigger meal in the middle of the day, and then maybe a lighter meal in the afternoon, and having that fasting window be more in the evening time, which is sort of opposite of what a lot of us do. We tend to go all day without eating, then we're starving, and then we eat all kinds of stuff, whether it's good or not good for us in the evening.
Yeah, and it's harder to spread out your protein. That's another
It is.
thing that
Oh, that's huge. That's huge. Yeah, I think that's another thing I see really commonly is people coming with under eating protein. And regardless of whether they're fasting or not, but when you're fasting and you're only eating a couple meals a day, it's very easy to undereat protein. And so now, I think the research is very clear on, especially for women who are exercising around perimenopause, we want to get closer to a gram of protein per pound of body weight a day. That's not easy to do. It requires a lot of attention, a lot of planning. And so, if you're only eating 2 meals a day, it can be very hard to meet that goal. So that's where I think, fasting, we may look at it as how can we, if we really want to do it, how can we implement it in a way that's still allowing us to get the calories we need, to get the protein that we need, and not overdoing that as a stressor.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be as simple as just like maybe just not eating a couple hours before bedtime, right? And then you have
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's funny that we have to call this fasting, but for in our culture, we do. I think, 12 hours at night is a very normal amount of time to go without eating, but so many of us don't get that unless we're cognizant of it because we're busy. Maybe we work out late, we're taking our kids to games and after school activities, we get home at 8 or 9, and then we're eating late, and then we're up early in the morning and doing it all again. And so we start eating early and we don't have that 12-hour window, but that's a very, normal amount of time we need our body to go into more of that rest and digest mode overnight. And if anyone's used a sleep tracker, I'm sure you've seen the pattern. If you eat a late meal, a late big meal, oh boy, that has a big impact on your sleep metrics, on your HRV. And so that can be very enlightening. Just having that 3-hour window before bedtime where you're not eating can make a huge difference.
Yeah, 100%. And then just quickly, because it is relevant to this audience too, before we leave fasting, is you had mentioned some like real contraindications for it, and one being like the
Mm-hmm.
hypothyroid thing, which we see a lot in the menopause
Mm-hmm.
space, and a
Mm-hmm.
history of eating disorders, which also sadly we see a lot of in this space.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those
Those two are big contraindications. And, I think with hypothyroidism, you can be cautious of it because it's often, it's autoimmune in nature, and there is some benefit to periodic fasting in autoimmune disease, but you want to be doing it with, someone who's overseeing your numbers and making sure that it is benefiting you. Um, I think, and be very cautious with it. I think for sure eating disorders we have to be cautious with, and they're so prevalent, and there's so many different ways that they present. And so that's something, to just understand yourself and what your relationship is like with food. And I think this just comes back to fasting in general. What is the intention behind it, right? Is it because you're trying to shift body composition or lose weight? And if that's the case, is there a better way to achieve that goal than fasting? There might be, given your situation. And then of course, pregnancy and breastfeeding are two other contraindications where we
yeah.
don't want to be doing fasting as well. And I think, just bringing it back to overall thinking about fasting in women, my general recommendations for women who are still cycling, who are before perimenopause, would be very rare. Do I recommend fasting more than 12 hours? There are definitely indications to do so, but it's very rare in my mind. And that's because, we have these big fluctuations in hormones month to month, and there are certain times where we're just not well suited. So, during the follicular phase, that's, as I'm sure everybody knows, the time where you can take on more stressors, right? You can do harder workouts, you can maybe incorporate some fasting, and your body can handle that. But then during the luteal phase, we just don't have that same resilience. And so when women are doing fasting all month long, we can experience some problems, but incorporating it maybe periodically. And if you're going to do it during that follicular phase would be the time to do it. And then as we get to perimenopause, I think that's where, it's all over the map, because there's a lot of, we don't even have the regular hormone monthly fluctuations. It's a little bit all over the map. It's hard to predict when your body can handle it. And then once we get to menopause, you don't have those fluctuations. And so it can be a better time to incorporate fasting so long as it fits into that overall allostatic load and is something that can be helpful and not necessarily harmful for you.
Yeah, no, that's a great wrap up. And being mindful, especially of the cortisol, because, in menopause, I think that, there's so much anxiety and stress, it's hard to manage anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so much of it is, it's hard to separate too sometimes our, perceptions and the messages that we're hearing from, the world, diet culture, all of these other places versus what's actually true for us. And so really trying to tune into your own body and see how you respond to different things, I think it becomes very important because we've been shaped by these messages for our whole lives.
Oh, 100%. And also, this audience is so unique. Like, so many of the messages in the general population are just that. They're in the general population where people, maybe they're walking every day a bit, or, they're doing this sort of the minimum exercise recommendations, and they're not actually purposely training or doing truly stressful physical
Hmm.
activity, so those
Yeah.
are very different populations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. We've got both extremes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And everywhere in between.
So let's pivot a little bit. I've been following your journey into self-reflection, which I have found
Mm,
really interesting. You've been very
mm,
public about some pretty deep internal work, trying to get back in touch with yourself after what I understand, you feeling pretty disconnected with yourself with
mhm,
as you chased
mhm.
achievements and what you perceive like the world wanted you to be. And menopause is a really big time. Like, this midlife menopause time is an
Yeah.
enormous time of self-reflection. And though you're not there yet, I do think the audience can benefit from hearing a bit about your journey and how you came across this and like what you've been doing to sort of find yourself, in this little bit of a tunnel of confusion that you found yourself in.
Yes. Oh, thank you for asking. I love talking about this. And I think in life there are so many natural points where we can pause for reflection or where life is sort of taking a different direction. And, obviously menopause is one of those. For me, I was really great. And I think for many people, the pandemic was one of those opportunities, right? It just sort of forced it upon us to our lives changed and a lot of us took a step back to think about things. And so the pandemic for me came at a time where I was also making a big life transition. I was graduating from residency, and this was a big time of reflection for me that I'm really grateful for. Before that, my life had always been about sort of achievement and perfectionism, right? I grew up doing gymnastics,
Oh
where it's
boy.
all about perfection and school. I was always very, teacher's pet, always very good in school. I was the girl who was not happy with A's. I wanted A pluses and was never good enough. I was my own worst critic. And, that really carried through medical school where I competed in CrossFit and then residency. And, I wouldn't change any of those things because I think it was all part of my path. But I think there were a lot of things that I woke up to that I realized I had um, sort of where I had strayed from the person that I wanted to be because I was so focused on achieving, competing in CrossFit and doing well in school that I let a lot of other things that are important in life fall to the side and they just became less important. And so, number one being relationships. I still, of course, I had friends and I had a relationship with my family, but really, if I look back at my behaviors and my actions, like nothing was more important than getting my training done and, doing what I needed to do for school. And so that meant just not having the same kind of deep relationships with friends and with my family. And that led me astray at certain points in life where I, made big life decisions and I didn't have that sort of, I'm obsessed with Michelle Obama and she talks about her kitchen table of women who, she would go to for advice and could talk about anything. And I didn't have that. And where I did, where I did have friends who were there to speak truth to me, I couldn't really hear them or listen to them because I was so focused on my own kind of what I thought was best, my own achievements. And so that led me astray. I think certainly falling into the pattern of just wanting to live the life that I thought other people expected of me. Like you do well in CrossFit, you do well in school, you think, oh, I'm going to be a doctor. People expect me to post on social media. So I'm going to do that. And you, instead of really asking myself, like, what did I want and what was important to me? Um, and so, I think that I graduated from residency during the pandemic. Because of that, I had some free time and free space, which was unexpected. And that was the first time in a very long time in life that I had that. And I am so grateful for it, because I think that had I just gone right from residency into a
Mm.
traditional primary care job, which many people do, I probably would have just gotten busy with life and continued to be on this treadmill, and maybe looked up 20 or 30 years when I was in, perimenopause or menopause, and maybe my kids had left the house, and been like, wow, how did I get here? But, I'm so grateful that I had this time, in my early 30s to take a step back and say, there's some things that I want to change about life, and, things that influences that I want to shift. And so I did go into this really deep state of reflection. I read a lot of books. I spent a lot of time meditating. I did counseling. I even did a fasting retreat 5 days. So this is another application of fasting, can be for mental clarity and sort of spiritual connection. So I did a fasting silent retreat in the woods by myself. And that really started for me this sort of new direction and new journey. And in that process, I started healing a lot of relationships, just, I wrote a lot of letters to family and friends, spending more time on relationships. I took time away from social media. So I even went to the point of deleting my Instagram account, which is a little crazy because you can't, they make you, when you go to delete it, they say, are you sure? Because you can't get this back. But
Wow.
I just knew it was an important action for me to take, to just say that this does not have control over me, and so I ended up deleting it. And then by some miracle, weeks later, I got it back. A friend convinced me that it probably wasn't the best idea, because I do have a platform and I can use that platform for positive. But I took time away from social media. I really got rid of all those external influences so I could start to hear my own voice and my own truth, and then make some changes in life to start living in accordance with that truth. And then the last several years have been just continuing on that journey. So lots of growth, lots of reflection. For so long I had been very emotionally, I think, closed off. And so for me, a lot of that was just like letting emotion come up and learning how to deal with it and learning what it means, and learning different tools. And so it's been a wild ride, but very rewarding. And I couldn't be happier with where I'm going now. I feel like I really know myself. I know where I'm going. And have, I think for me, most importantly, I have a much stronger spiritual connection. I'm, a believer that there is higher power, and that, we're all here for a reason. And that to me has been, something that I think led me down this path and is taking me where I'm going.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think that this transitional, I mean, they call it the menopause transition. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's many things happening in that transition, but I do believe that if you spend, and I don't know that everybody needs to go on a silent fasting retreat to get
No,
there,
it's
I
not.
mean, I think
I
that
always tend to take things a little to the extreme. So
that's awesome. But I do think, like, because you can reach, you spend so much time, especially in this place, ticking boxes, right? Like, okay, have I done this,
hmm.
this, this?
Yes.
You have maybe older kids and older parents, or, all these
Yes.
things, and your life you can really get to a place where you have lost yourself, and you're just like, what am I
Yes.
about? What am I doing? Like, what do I want
Hmm.
to be on the other
Hmm.
side of this transition? I say that all the time because it is a real time of power where you're just like, okay,
Hmm.
I'm entering the me phase of this thing, and
Yeah. And
yeah.
for so many women, like, it's finally, you're at this point where you've been so consumed with caring for everybody else for so many years, right? Whether it's your partner, your children, your parents, your family, your siblings, your community. And oftentimes it's a time to look up, and, your body's changing and it's starting to tell you, hey, I need some attention too. It's time to take care of you. And that's a really beautiful thing. I think that the other unfortunate thing about the world that we live in for women is that the world we live in is very designed for men, right? It's designed in a way that for us to have these consistent schedules all month long, the 9 to 5 and, daycare and all these things. But, there's so much power in in the way women are designed and, leaning into that, knowing that, oh, wow, this is a natural life. Like, I think men have midlife crises too,
Mm,
where, they're also going through some transition, but this is a natural phase that your body goes through. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's this opportunity to step back and ask these questions again, like have gratitude for, all the other prior phases of your life. And then look at, okay, where am I going and who am I? And what do I want for this next phase of my life?
yeah, excellent. And I would, speaking of phases of your life, I'd like to sort of transition into where you are now. I mean, you are part of the clinical team as vice president of clinical development at Wild Health. Is that correct?
I don't know if I specifically have that title, but I'm
It's where I
seeing
pulled it from the
patients.
internet.
Yes,
So
it might
somebody
be
called
old.
you that.
Yes, I'm seeing patients and I help with some of our marketing related to the CrossFit community.
Okay. We also have a very frequent guest, Dr. Carla DiGirolamo, works as an
Yes,
endocrine consultant there. What led you to Wild Health? And can you explain a bit about like what it is?
sure. So I came to Wild Health during that transition period, after residency. It wasn't what I had originally planned. I had thought I wanted to do a direct primary care practice and use a functional medicine approach and focus especially on people who were sort of in the CrossFit or fitness community. And then I met the team from Wild Health and was really impressed with what they were doing, and wanted to be part of that mission of just reaching more people and bringing this type of care to more people. And what intrigued me most is that we're doing this cutting edge care. I think it's a great balance of doing things that are evidence based or science based, data driven, but also being very open to um other modalities and using each person as their own N of one experiment and just using them using this N of one experiment approach where you know some doctors might say like, oh, well, we don't know if acupuncture, if there's great studies for acupuncture for that specific indication, but we would say, well, let's try it, right? Like, let's see if it works for you. Let's have a metric that we're going to track to see if it's something that actually helps you. And that I think is a really fun and creative approach. And so what we do with patients is we start with every patient, we get a very detailed view of your labs as well as your genetics. And we use those to help guide us to design those N of one experiments to try to get closer to optimal for you in the shortest amount of time. Um, and when I first joined, we were looking at partnering with CrossFit to provide this care for the CrossFit community. So that was very exciting, and that has evolved over the last few years. And now we're a official sponsor of the CrossFit Games, so we're still very much involved in the CrossFit community, and that's been really rewarding for me because I see them as complementary. CrossFit I think is an incredible tool for improving health, with the obviously the fitness approach, nutrition, but also the community aspect. And so wrapping around this type of medical care I think is very powerful.
Yeah, and it's Dr. Peter Attia, which I'm sure you're familiar with him and the Drive
Sure,
podcast
yeah.
and his Outlive book. But I mean, he in his book he calls it Medicine 3.0, which I think is an interesting
Mhm.
way to look at it. Is that we the first phase was maybe just understanding the body and disease, it's sort of that basic fundamental
Mhm.
level, and then we're sort of in 2.0 where you get sick and we do something about it, but this
Mhm.
is more like we can start seeing we know what leads to the sick and maybe we can do something about it. It could be called
Right.
preventative medicine, but I think it's even a little more aggressive than that. I mean, it's really optimal health wellness medicine, right?
Right. It's, so much of our conventional healthcare system is sick care. It's how it's designed. It's basically monitoring you and waiting until you get sick. And then we do something. And usually that doing something involves a drug or a procedure. But I think, people are very much now looking for a different approach where we are not only being preventative, but we're looking for root causes. And so if you come with a symptom, we want to understand what's the root cause of that symptom and how can we address that instead of covering it up with a medicine that has more side effects and then maybe you need another medicine. Not to bash. I think for pharmaceuticals, there are incredible pharmaceuticals out there that have incredible impact, but it's not everything, right? And so there's so much that we can do to address the root cause, and that's very much the approach that we take. Is let's look at all the data. Now We have so much data out there, and I think we want to empower individuals with their own data instead of that being something the healthcare system owns. So you should know your DNA. You should know all of your labs. You have these wearables that you can track your sleep and your HRV and your blood sugar, and then experiment. Know what are the behaviors that impact you personally and impact those numbers and help you feel well and perform well, and achieve whatever goals they are that you are going for.
Yeah, and speaking of like peri and postmenopausal women specifically, like this is definitely a time when you can see where a woman really should put her health at front and center, right? Because
Hmm.
you can see lipids start to rise and cortisol and blood sugar may be harder to manage.
Hmm.
Do you work with many women in this space? Can you sort of speak a little bit about your experience with working with this demographic?
Sure. Yes, we work frequently with this demographic, and I think it's a great time to get a handle on your data and what's happening. I think that this is a frequent demographic that's coming to us. One, because you're experiencing symptoms. Maybe you've had a couple nagging health things along the way, but you've sort of pushed through. Now you're experiencing different symptoms, or the things that you've tried before for losing weight or gaining health just aren't working anymore. It's also a time where you're maybe seeing your parents get sick or family members get sick, and you want to prevent those conditions from happening in you. You've maybe got young kids, or you've got kids who are maybe going to be having their own kids soon, and you want to be around to be part of their lives. And so it's a great time to start looking at all of your data. And so we really dive deep. We look at really comprehensive, DNA in a number of different areas. We look at labs. Our health report that we go through combines your DNA and your labs as well as your health history, and it looks at your nutrition, exercise, sleep, neurobehavioral, which is mood and mindfulness. And then it looks at disease prevention. So we look at your heart disease risk in a very comprehensive approach, Alzheimer's risk, insulin resistance, inflammation, and longevity, which includes cancer risk as well. And, labs that we do, we're looking at lipids and a lot of cardiovascular risk markers. We're looking at all kinds of micronutrients, methylation, detailed look at hormones, all of your sex hormones, thyroid hormones, your stress axis, insulin resistance markers, inflammatory markers. And then, depending on the person, we might want to dive deeper in other areas as well. So we may do a deeper dive on microbiome, or we may do a deeper dive on hormones with things like a Dutch test. And for various other reasons, we might do other detailed testing.
And it can sound kind of overwhelming, but like, I mean, you take all of this information and I'm hearing that it's a multi-prong approach. So
Hmm.
you're making dietary recommendations or medicinal recommendations? Like, is it all
Hmm.
of it? Yeah.
It's everything. So in your first, when you join, you get all of this data. You also, I think one of the part of the magic of our approach is that every patient works with a doctor and a health coach. So I get to meet with a patient and go through all their data with them and come up with a plan based on, their labs and their medical conditions. But then they're seeing a health coach. Many of my patients will see their health coaches weekly. So that's about implementing this plan and problem solving and troubleshooting and feeling like I might throw a ton of information at you in the first hour, but how do we break this down and actually put it into practice? And so the recommendations, I generally, unless there's something very severe or urgent, we're going to start with a lifestyle first approach, maybe some supplements, and then medications are there as needed. We also work with patients who are already on medications who maybe want to come off of them. Maybe they're on medications for diabetes or hypertension, and over time, we're able to get them off those medications. So, I really look at it as we can be complementary. If you've got a primary care doctor or an OBGYN or a specialist that you're working with, we can be really complementary in working with them, using both, the lifestyle, alternative approach, functional medicine approach, but also medications as needed.
Excellent. So as an athlete yourself, you have some unique insights into the mindset and the mental challenges that can come with that. This is a time, speaking of perimenopause and menopause,
Yeah.
when active and athletic women and myself included, still sort of have to wrangle this monster sometimes where you can really struggle with identity and body image.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
do you help women at all with that facet of their lives, or do you have thoughts on how women can deal with these issues that don't go away? They're always with you, and
Yeah.
sometimes they can really flame up and get worse at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this has been so much of my own work over these last few years as well. And it's absolutely, I think it's the core of what we do. I think, or at least the core of us in our health is it starts with our thoughts, right? And so many of us, I think, as a human, part of what we have to overcome in life is this. Um, so many of us that struggle with this lack of self-worth or this negative self-talk, and that's it's a big, like you said, it's a big monster sometimes. And so I work with a lot of my patients on thought work, so being able to identify, when you have those thoughts coming up, being more aware of them and how do you process through them. Looking at how do you create a more positive environment so that you're not feeding that negative side of things. And then working through, I mean, so much of this for us comes from it's deep stuff back into our childhood and how we were patterned, how our nervous systems were patterned early on. And so working through that, whether it's with a therapist, with different techniques that you can work on your own, I think is so important. When it comes to thought work, have you ever heard of Byron Katie's The Work?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
4 questions. Yeah. So she has these 4 questions, and I've found this to be really helpful, for myself and with patients, that when you have a negative thought come up, like maybe you're looking at yourself in the mirror when you're getting dressed and you're like, "Oh, I'm fat." And you have to the first question you ask yourself is that true? And maybe you say, "Yeah, it's true." And then you ask yourself, "Can you be 100% like absolutely sure that that's true?" And you know, I guess part of it can depend on what your definition is of fat at that moment, but I've yet to come across the thought where we can be 100% absolutely sure that's true. And then you ask yourself, how do I feel when I think that thought? And most of us, when we think that, are going to feel pretty lousy about
Mhm.
ourselves, right? And then you ask, how do I feel if I never had that thought again? Like, what if your thought was only, I'm so beautiful and I love my body and my body is incredible? Wow, you feel really good, right? And so then you start to turn that thought around. Maybe instead of saying I'm fat, you say like, I love my body and all that it's done for me, or I love the natural curves that I have, or the way that it's, birthed these children, or whatever it is that you can turn it around and start to experience different thoughts. So we know there's very clear research on this whole field of study called psychoneuroimmunology. And it's where, our thoughts, our psychology are then directly impacting our nervous system, our immune system, our endocrine system. So when we have that negative thought, it sends off the same alarm bells, the same cortisol spike, the same sympathetic response as if evolutionarily we're being chased by a tiger and our body doesn't know the difference. And so then what does that lead to over time if we're constantly in that space? It leads to inflammation, it leads to immune system dysregulation, it leads to, autoimmune disease, high blood sugar, insulin resistance, GI issues, so many different things just because of our thoughts. And it's hard. It's like really, really hard to shift, right? Because we can make ourselves believe just about anything. And the forces that are pulling us to believe those negative thoughts are so strong. And we've been hearing them for so long. But I can guarantee you, if you just lean into it and you start to practice some of these techniques, you will start to see the shift. And then the more you start to see the shift, the more hope you have and momentum you have that this actually works and it's possible. So I would encourage everybody to at least entertain doing some of that type of thought work.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I was at a women's gravel festival last week, and I had a lot of listeners come up to me, and
Hmm.
they're very grateful, just to have these conversations and to hear these conversations. But one woman, and I'm gonna really try not to cry because it was so moving.
Oh.
Um, she said she she rides mostly with younger women, and she said,
Hmm.
"I'm so ashamed of my aging body. Sometimes I don't want to ride with them."
Wow.
right?
Mm.
And I was just like, oh, and I
Uh,
and it hit me so hard at a time because I was I'm training for this triathlon and I was going
mhm.
swimming with some of my colleagues who are quite a bit younger, and I don't have the muscle tone I used to. I don't like it just doesn't look my body doesn't look the same. And I
Sure.
had those feelings. I was like, I don't know if I want to go. You know, so it can
Mm.
actually stop you from
Yeah,
doing these things that are so good for you mentally and physically. It's really profound. And we grew up in a
totally.
time when like fucking Cosmo magazine was like, bars over people's eyes, like, "Look at this person," like,
Right.
shaming them in the pages of national magazines, like, "Oh, you should never
Mhm.
wear shorts after age whatever." I mean, that doesn't that
Right.
doesn't go away overnight.
Totally. And you know what's crazy is the way that we make these stories up in our own heads that are most likely not true. And the way that we compare, like, think it's so natural for women to compare, right? You're saying, like, oh, these women are younger, or maybe they have more muscle tone or whatever. Most likely, those younger women are looking at you or this woman that you talk to and being like, wow, like she's incredible. I want to be doing this when I'm, older too. And it's inspiring. But if she lets that thought then impact, her decision to enter that race or do that, then these other women don't see that. And so they
Right.
don't have that to look forward to or to look up to. And I think naturally just because these influences we tend to compare ourselves, and we tend to compare ourselves in a negative way instead of appreciating how unique we all are, appreciating this incredible um you know the incredible parts of being a woman and all the different phases of life that we go through, and knowing that it's this rising tide that lifts all boats. The more that we support each other and lift each other up, the better that we all are. And I think the world needs us. Like, the world needs women to be fully in their power and fully at their best, because we're suffering without it. We need that.
I 100% agree, and I often, when I'm in that space, will talk to myself the way I talk to my daughter, where I'm like,
Yes.
"You are thinking about you way more than anyone else is thinking
Yes.
about you," I mean, that's
Absolutely. And we get so
yeah.
in our heads about it. I think that's such a great technique of talking to yourself as if you're a friend or your daughter, talking to yourself as if you're someone else. I used that just last week. I had just like a rough day where I got so in my head. I ended up going to sleep, just kind of crying myself to sleep because I was so frustrated, and my head was swarming with all those negative thoughts. And I woke up the next morning and I just wrote myself a letter as if I was writing to a friend, not writing to myself. And all of this incredible stuff came through. It's somehow by taking yourself out of your own head and writing to yourself as if you're someone else, we're able to really pass along so much wisdom. And then it really sunk in for me, and just made such a big difference. And I've experienced such a shift. So, we're often so much better at taking care of everybody, everybody else besides ourselves. So sometimes use that to your advantage, and, talk to yourself as if you're a friend, or write yourself a letter as if you're a friend, and you'll be surprised what might come out.
I love that. I love that. I appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom with us today. And is there anything, as we wrap up, that we haven't talked about, or any messages that you would like to leave our audience about taking care of themselves in this next chapter of their lives?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. I just think, aside from what we've already talked about, I think there's also so much power in being together. So, obviously listening to podcasts like this is very empowering because you get so much information and you are part of this community. But so much of our pain, like you said, the thoughts that we have comes from the way that we tend to isolate ourselves and all the shame that's associated, and the way that that tends to keep us in our own heads and keep us isolated. So I would encourage you, find a few women that you really trust that can be, or like Michelle Obama says, your kitchen table, or your women that you travel through this phase of life through and other phases of life through, and just, reach out. It's a little bit scary to do that or be the first person to do that. But when we open up, we realize that, everybody else is going through some variation of the same thing, and it's normal. And what we're seeing on the outside is usually not what's actually happening on the inside. And I think that makes the journey so much more rewarding, and so much more fun, and we're able to help each other because, the things that you've been through, you might be able to share and help somebody else and vice versa. And we don't feel like we're going through it so isolated. And I think that's just true for menopause in general. For so long, it was something that was taboo and nobody talked about it. And your doctor doesn't really have much for you. And so it is very isolating, but let's lean into, going through it together and, empowering each other to be at our best. I think that the best years are ahead of you. I think sometimes when women are in menopause, they're seeing all the things that have gone on before and thinking, oh, it's downhill from here, but that is so not the case. I think it can be the best. I think as we get older, the best years are always ahead of us because we have so much wisdom, we have so much life experience. And I think we just keep getting better and better and better.
Excellent. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with Dr. Nikki Kay, author of Hormones, Health, and Human Potential, a guide to understanding your hormones to optimize your health and performance. We had a brilliant discussion of health, performance, and hormones that you will not want to miss. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.